Good day, everyone. My name is Kimberly Lynn Dulay, and I will be your reporter for today. I will be discussing about the 20th century to the contemporary period. The contents of my report are History of the early 20th century, the 20th century art, the contemporary period, other novel types. History of the early 20th century. Radical advancement of science and technology. Development of technology. The first powered airplane was invented by Wright brothers on December 17, 1903. The first practical telephone, patented by Alexander Graham Bell on June 1875. Commercial radio broadcasting began in 1920s, which became an important mass medium for entertainment and news. The television was made practical by John Lodge Baird in 1928. Expansion of knowledge. Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud was published by 1900s. The effect of the theory of evolution developed by Darwin. As a result, creation and confusion in values of ethics and morals. 1901 to 1910. The reign of the King Edward VII. The era was prosperous. However, there are growing forces of discontent and resentment. A lot of crises with serious social and political instability arising from the Irish crisis, labor unrest, the women's suffrage. The Edwardian era existed in a twilight zone. At that time, the balance of power in so many areas was shifting in Europe. 1910. The succession of George V to the throne established the modern pattern of exemplary conduct for British royalty. He tried to continue the popularity of the monarchy. Old traditions were being challenged everywhere. The greatest industrial unrest in Britain's history in 1911. 1914 to 1918. World War I. 28th of July 1914 to 11th of November 1918. By the end of the war, the German Empire, Russian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire was ceased to exist. The war had been won by Britain and its allies, but at terrible human and financial cost, creating a sentiment that war should never be fought again. In 1921, independence of Southern Ireland from Britain, Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921 established the Irish Free State. In 1928, women's suffrage. Women over the age of 21 are given the vote. In 1929, the Great Depression originated in the United States in late 1929. 1929 to 1945. World War II. Causes. Unresolved tasks in World War I. Great Depression. Tension among nations aftermath. The aftermath of World War II. United Nations. European market. The European economy had collapsed. Marshall Plan. The World War II impact. Casualties and war crimes. concentration camps, slave labor, and genocide, home fronts and production, advances in technology and warfare. The 20th century art. 20th centuries had huge changes in the modes and meaning of artist production. The break with academic values reevaluate aesthetics, technique, color, media, and so on. The secession movement, Fauvism, Cubism, Expressionism, Futurism, and so on. The 20th century was the stage for some of the greatest modern artists in history. Fauvism, an art derived from the French word wild beast. Primitivism movement, centered in Paris in the 20th century. The well-known Fauvist artist, Henri Matisse, artist often regarded as the most important French painter of the 20th century. His subjects were largely domestics or figurative, and a distinct Mediterranean verve resides in the treatment. André Derain, French painter, sculptor, printmaker, and designer who was one of the principal Fauvists. Well-known artists. Pablo Picasso. He is a Spanish artist. He picked up the gauntlet of Cubism. Futurism, an Italian movement in the 1920s based on a fascination movement, technology, and machinery. Contemporary period. William Butler Yeats. Name: William Butler Yeats. Date of birth: 13th of June 1865 to 28th of January 1939. Achievements: an Irish poet and one of the foremost figures of the 20th century literature. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature as the first Irishman. Feature: born in Sandymount, Ireland, and educated there and in London, his earliest volume of verse was published in 1889. William Butler Yeats' style: the master of the traditional forms, use elusive imagery and symbolic structures. Yeats chose words and assembled them to suggest other abstract thoughts that may seem more significant and resonant. His uses of symbols is usually meant something physical. His later poetry and plays are written in a more personal vein. Interest in mysticism, spiritualism, occultism, and astrology. His use of symbols is usually meant something physical. William Butler Yeats literature. Number 1. Crazy Jane talks with the bishop. The poem is in 3 stanzas with 6 lines. It expresses his own renewed passion of life and for love. Crazy Jane's philosophy is Yeats' own philosophy, that body and soul are God's creation, hence the two are equally holy. T.S. Eliot biography. Name: Thomas Stearns Eliot. Date of birth: 26th of September 1888 to 4th of January 1965. Job: essayist, publisher, playwright, literary and social critic. Achievement: a Nobel Prize winner, one of the 20th century's major poets. Life: T.S. Eliot's childhood. It is self-evident that St. Louis affected me more deeply than any other environment has ever done. I consider myself fortunate to have been born here rather than in Boston or New York or London. T.S. Eliot was affected by the city London. He was inspired by Dante's philosophy, helped by Ezra Pound. He was infatuated with literature due to his bad health. T.S. Eliot Life. Vivian Highwood Eliot, 1915. She was his first wife, whom she married in 1915, then they separated in 1933. 1938. Mary Trevelyan. She was his forthright English companion. She wants to marry T.S. Eliot and proposed to him more than once, but no avail. 1957. Esme Valerie Fletcher died on the 9th of November 2012. She was the second wife and the later widow of the Nobel Prize-winning poet T.S. Eliot. In 1960s, T.S. Eliot worked as an editor for the Wesleyan University Press. In 1965, 4th of January, he cremated at the Golden Glen Crematorium in accordance with his wishes. His ashes were taken to St. Michael's Church in Easter Oaker. T.S. Eliot's literature. The Hollow Man in 1925 has complex themes, divided into 5 parts, consists of 98 lines. The last 4 lines are the most quoted lines among any 20th century poems. Allusions to Conrad's character and Guy Fawkes. Virginia Woolf biography. Name: Adeline Virginia Woolf. Date of birth: 25 January 1882 to 28 of March 1941. Achievement: an English writer and one of the foremost modernists of the 20th century. Feature: shows strong feminism, and she experimented with streams of consciousness. Virginia Woolf childhood. 1894. Raped by stepbrother with bipolar disorder. She was abused by her stepbrother Gerald Duckworth when she was 6 years old, and again for many years her stepbrother George Duckworth when they were 12 and 14 years old than she. 1895. Death of mother. 1897. Virginia Woolf studied history and Greek of King's College, London. 1904. Death of her father. Committed suicide. In 1912, he married to Leonard Woolf. Virginia Woolf literature. Mrs. Dalloway, 1925. The Lighthouse, 1927. Orlando, 1928. A Room of One's Own, 1929. The Mark on the Wall, 1921. Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, 1923. Modern Fiction, 1919. A Room of One's Own, published on 24th of October 1921. 9. Based on a series of lectures, the conception of a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction, constructs a critical and historical account of women writers this far. James Joyce Biography. Name: James Augustine Aloysius Joyce. Date of birth: 2nd of February 1882 to 13th of January 1941. Achievement: an Irish novelist and poet, one of the most influential writers in the modernist avant-garde of the early 20th century. Feature: shows the real life of people in Dublin and criticism against Catholics. James Joyce's childhood. 1882. 1898. Enrolled at University College Dublin. In 1902, he left for Paris and death of his mother. In 1904, he met his fiancée, Nora Barnacle. In 1915, they moved to Switzerland, and in 1931, they got married. James Joyce Literature. Chamber Music, 1907. Dubliners, 1914. Exile, 1915. A Portrait of the Artist is a Young Man, 1916. Ulysses, 1922. Finnegan's Wake, 1929. James Joyce Literature. Collection of 15 stories. Dubliners, 1914. Form a naturalistic depiction of Irish middle-class life in and around Dublin. Many of the characters in Dubliners later appear in minor roles in Joyce's novel, Ulysses. Number 4. Other novel types. Commercial fiction is divided into many genres or categories. This kind of classification helps readers find the types of novels they like to read. For example, readers who are mainly interested in love stories can go straight to romance section of the bookstore. Each genre also has its own traditions. If you are interested in writing in a particular genre, it's important to read a lot of books in that genre in order to learn more about it and understand what readers will expect. Number 1. Mysteries. A mystery is about a crime, usually a murder, and the process of discovering who committed it. The heroine is usually a detective or an amateur doing detective work. The examples of mystery fiction is on the screen. Science fiction. Science fiction is fiction that imagines possible alternatives to a reality. It is a reality what if. For example, what if the world ended? What if there were life on other planets? The imaginary part of science fiction is based on known scientific facts. For example, if there is time travel in science fiction book, it will be done with technology, not by waving a magic wand. Fantasy. Like science fiction, fantasy is about imaginary worlds, but the imaginary part of fantasy novels usually involves magic, where the imaginary part of science fiction involves science or technology. Westerns. Westerns normally take place in the western U.S., although sometimes in other locations. Most often, during the 19th century, common elements include cowboys, ranchers, the difficulties of frontier life, frontier justice, and conflicts between natives and settlers. Horror. Horror fiction gets its name because it is focused on creating emotions of terror and dread in the reader. Horror fiction often accomplishes this through the use of scary supernatural elements or gore, but according to the Horror Writers Association, these elements are not required. Thrillers. Like horror, a thriller gets its name because of the feeling it creates in the reader. Thrillers are designed to make the reader's pulse race, to keep him or her turning pages. Often thrillers are about a crime that is going to be committed or a disaster that is going to happen, if the heroine doesn't prevent it. Romance. Romance fiction is about love and passion. Normally, the focus is on two characters who fall in love but have problems or obstacles keeping them apart, and there is a happy ending. Historical. Historical novels are set in a past time period, normally at least 50 years before they were written. They combine a made-up story with realistic details of that time period. Second, literary fiction is generally lumped all together in bookstores as general fiction or literature, because the first priority of literary authors is creating works of art, while selling books is only a second consideration. Literary authors are less likely to think in terms of writing a specific genre or category of novel and following the customs of that genre. Literary fiction. Some literary authors today write in a realistic way about the lives of the ordinary people, what is known as a contemporary realism. Some choose to introduce an element of magic or a spirit world in otherwise realistic stories. What is known as magical realism. Others create works of an art that incorporates traditions of commercial fiction genres such as mysteries and fiction. A number of literary authors also innovate with non-traditional approaches to storytelling, such as breaking up the order of events in the story, offering several alternative endings, or treating the reader as a character in the book. In this type of novel, the main point of often isn't just the story itself, but also the way the story is told. And that's all for the 20th century to the contemporary period and other novel types. Thank you for listening.